It's a pleasure to be back in Taiwan. I came here for the first time 40 years ago on a U.S. Navy destroyer and pulled into the port of Keelung and spent a good couple of days here in Taipei. Then we went to Kaohsiung down in the south, and it is marvelous to see. I have enjoyed watching it from afar, and it's a pleasure to be back with you today. What I'd like to talk about, and I'm going to show a few simple images, photographs really, is Indo-Asia. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And how does Taiwan fit into all that? Let me begin simply by stepping back into history for a moment. This is a chart from 1589 showing what the Europeans thought this body of water, this massive Pacific Ocean looked like. On the bottom right there, you see the Polynesians who sailed across these waters. This is an ancient region of the world. The United States has been here for some period of time, but let's look back at mariners in this region. You see that very small ship in the photograph? That is the vessel that Christopher Columbus sailed to discover the New World. It's tiny. That was in 1490. That massive ship behind it was being sailed in these waters at the same time by the Chinese Admiral Zheng He. It was 500 feet long, the largest wooden warship ever built. These waters are ancient waters. The United States came here as part of the Second World War, when we had more aircraft carriers in our Navy than we do ships today. So the United States is a relatively recent arrival to this region, but I hope that my nation will continue to engage in this region, particularly with Taiwan. But there is a new force rising in this region, as we all know. These are Chinese ballistic missile submarines operated by the People's Republic of China. You may have seen a story in the New York Times yesterday that points out that China now has more ships than the U.S. Navy. That's an interesting statistic. It does not tell the real story of capability, but it makes the point that there is a new force rising, and we must understand the implications of that. We see the Chinese Navy operating all over the world. Here is a port visit of a Chinese destroyer to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. We see China operating in the Baltic Sea, in the north of Europe, alongside Russian warships. So China's Navy is expanding. It will continue to be a significant player in this region. And I think the greatest geopolitical challenge to peace in the region is this. It is the construction of artificial islands throughout the South China Sea. And I hope today, in our conversations, as we talk about promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific region, I think we have to address the challenges that result from this kind of militarization of international waters. In fairness, these views by the Chinese are based on that historical set of claims. That's why I began with that. It is important that we have an open dialogue with the PRC to understand why they feel they should be able to claim this entire body of water within the 9-dash line. I think that claim is not supported by international law, but we have to understand it so we can have a fruitful dialogue, so we can avoid conflict in this region. Now, we also see not just Chinese warships, but also Chinese Coast Guard and even civilian craft operating in these waters. All of that contributes to tension. It does not mean we are destined for a war at all. We can resolve this diplomatically. We must resolve this diplomatically, but it will require a great deal of effort from both sides. Now, there's a tactical challenge as well to all of this, and it's right there. It's North Korea. We cannot speak about a peaceful and open Indo-Pacific region without addressing the rise of North Korea's nuclear program. And this is going to be a challenge for the international order. This is not the job of the United States to solve. I think the United States will have an important role to play, but it will require all of the nations of this region, and really all of the nations globally, putting pressure on the regime of Kim Jong-un. And we talk a lot about his nuclear program. He also has an enormous conventional force which directly threatens South Korea, as well as continuing to move his ballistic missile capability. When I put all of that together, I see North Korea and integrating it ultimately into the international system peacefully as the tactical challenge that sits alongside the strategic challenge of finding our way through the disagreements we have strategically in the region. So those are some of the challenges we have to deal with. What's the good news? Well, let's start with nations like Taiwan, a strong friend, partner to the United States, and also to other nations in this region. As the chairman said earlier, the 22nd largest economy in the world, only 23 million people generating an enormous GDP, capable and professional armed forces. Taiwan is part of the solution in this part of the world. So is Japan. I was asked a question earlier by the press here at a small press conference I did about Taiwan-Japanese relations. I think they are very important. I am happy to see representatives of the Diet here today, and I honor them for coming. That relationship has historical parts to it, but it more importantly is part of the future of this region. And the United States has the closest of relations with Japan. And I think that that can be part of the solution in this region. We also have a challenge between China and Japan. These are, of course, the Senkaku Dayu Islands. This has been relatively quiet because of diplomatic efforts back and forth between those two nations. This is an example, I think, of how we could ultimately approach the challenges in the South China Sea. So Taiwan, Japan, who else? South Korea, another miracle economy. When you look at the progress of Taiwan, you look at the progress of South Korea, look at that photograph on the upper right. If you ever had a question about a political and economic solution to adopt for your nation, look at that chart. Those two nations started at the same point at the end of the Korean War. Today, Pyongyang has a tiny economy, almost no infrastructure. South Korea's economy is even larger than that of Taiwan. It is an extraordinary story and also a good potential partner in the region. There are other nations. These are Marines from the Philippines. We see Vietnam's forces increasing in capability. All of this is to say that the solutions to the challenges are in collective action together, principally diplomatic, economic, but working together for security as well. And of course, this was the concept for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Sadly, the United States has walked away from this. Japan continues to work toward constructing this. It is an example over time of how the economic instruments, alongside the political and the diplomatic, can help resolve the challenges in this region. So it is a rich basket of challenges. We've named some of them. Right about now, you should say, well, what is the role of the United States? Can the United States overcome its political gridlock? Can it avoid isolationism? I say the answer is yes. The United States will help think its way through the challenges in Asia. We do not aim to be the dominant nation of the Pacific, but we aim to be part of finding opportunities in the region. So let me close my brief remarks and open up for some questions with a few very quick thoughts on these opportunities. What should we do to create dialogue together? We should start with this. We should listen better. This, by the way, is not Photoshop. This is an actual air defense system from 1925, 100 years ago. He is listening for incoming aircraft. I put it here as metaphor. We must listen better to each other, to our allies, partners, and friends, but also to those with whom we have disagreements. We need to read more and think about this region. Here are some books by writers from the United States about the region. We need to read these as well as reading the comparable works of literature and political science from Taiwan, from Japan, from China as well. We need more conferences like this where we come together and have a dialogue realistically about these opportunities. We need to work together to address the challenges in the South China Sea. We need to build large coalitions to address global problems. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. Look closely. You'll see flags from this region, Australia, New Zealand, others. We need to think more about India. We need to put the Indo in the Indo-Pacific region. This is the Golden Temple of Amritsar. It is sacred to the Sikh faith. I put it here as a symbol of the rise of India in this century. We spend a lot of time talking about the rise of China. In 300 years, when historians write the history of the 21st century, much of it will be about the rise of India. And in this regard, I am particularly encouraged by the growing relationship between Japan, India, and the United States. This is an image from a recent naval exercise conducted by those nations together, three very capable maritime nations, an example of collective security operating together. There's also a role for private sector. These are large maritime companies operating. This private-public partnership to help us understand the health of the oceans, the commerce in the oceans, $5 trillion of commercial activity in the South China Sea, understanding that and integrating it into our conversations is part of creating real security. And lastly, soft power. The minister a moment ago talked about Chinese sharp power. I would argue soft power, medical diplomacy, and many other tools can be part of creating real security in the region. So let me close by saying, as I look out at the oceans today, they don't look like the graphic behind me, nice calm sea. The oceans today look more like this. There will be challenges. Things will go wrong. But I would argue that if we apply the tools I've talked about today, dialogue, diplomacy, collective defense, the economic instruments, private-public cooperation, if we integrate those together, we can create calm seas ahead. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Admiral. And Admiral has kindly decided that he will be open up to questions. Just a few points. If you raise your questions, please identify yourself and please keep your questions crisp and short so our Admiral will have time to respond. We don't want long questions. So any questions from the floor? Right over there.
That conversations and discussions are very necessary. In your previous lectures and speeches, the Xi's consolidation of power will make China an even more formidable competitor to the United States in East Asia and around the globe. So I was wondering if you could further elaborate on the extent to which we're Vice President of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question is, how can the United States and Taiwan work together using smart power, which is principally some of these ideas of soft power backed up by collective defense. I showed you a photograph a moment ago of a massive U.S. hospital ship, the Mercy. I think that medical diplomacy is an area where we could work together. I think humanitarian operations, working with nations that need assistance in building clinics and schools and wells, for example, for clean water. I think that working together in counter-pandemic situations and preparing for a response to that kind of natural disaster is crucial and important. I mentioned earlier economic integration. How can we create bilateral or multilateral trade agreements that enable a freer flow of goods back and forth? How about student exchanges? We had, for example, the chairman who has a PhD from Purdue University. We have Minister Wu who has a PhD from Ohio State University. Where are the student exchanges? How can we create that kind of human capital moving back and forth between the United States, Taiwan, and other nations we talk about? In the same vein, sports diplomacy, our athletes exchanging opportunities to compete together. There are many, many ways, and all of these may seem individually like small actions, and yet taken together, collectively, they create real security. That's how I would answer the question. Thank you.
Okay, Admiral, right over here.
Way to calm it down.
An excellent question, and as I mentioned earlier, I compliment our Japanese colleagues who are here today for the way in which they have used a mixture of diplomacy and security to deal with this challenge. My friend Professor Joseph Nye, who, if you will, invented the idea of soft power, once said that soft power without the ability to apply hard power is no power. And I think that's right. Part of the way that the solution to the Senkaku dispute has occurred is because Japan and its defense forces have operated there. The United States has operated there in support. China sees that, sees a resolute front, and then feels compelled to come to the table of diplomacy. I think that will be the same trajectory in the South China Sea. We must operate through these international waters, and it cannot just be the United States. It must be our friends from Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and France, and the United Kingdom, and others, because all of us, all of our nations have an interest in freedom of the high seas, international waters that are free to all to transit. If we show a resolute face in that, over time, I do believe China will be more willing to negotiate, to have a diplomatic solution. I'll close by saying we will not solve this by snapping our fingers. This will take time. It will require patience, but we must solve it. This, I think, is the biggest geostrategic challenge in the region, and the place where the potential for conflict is the highest. We must avoid that, but it does require a resolute face to the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. I see a question right over there.
These days, technology evolved.
The question is, how will sea power be impacted by the emergence of cyber and space? And this is a very, very appropriate question for today. First of all, let's take space. And here we see broad area surveillance getting better and better, more persistent, more defined, and believe me, over time, the ability from satellites to see where submarines are operating beneath the waters will change forever the way sea power is applied. That is coming, and it will be in 10 years or 50 years, but eventually that's an example of persistent surveillance from space that will impact the maritime world. Cyber, similarly, as all of these platforms that we talked about today rely on this backbone of cyber capability, the ability to intrude into that from distance is increasing relentlessly and makes it much more difficult, for example, to track merchant fleets where they are operating, to use big data to analyze patterns of movement. So we will see space and cyber impact sea power, impact the maritime world dramatically over the next 10 years, I predict. That's why, and I'll close on this, I think it is a smart move on the part of the U.S. to create a space force, small but capable, and ultimately a cyber force. I believe all nations will find that they are going to need capability in those two areas as well as in the maritime sphere in order to maintain security on the oceans and thus the impact ashore. Again, thank you very much for having me here today, Annie. It's a pleasure. I look forward to the rest of the conference and above all, Chairman, to the dinner tonight when we will continue to interact together and solve these great challenges. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Admiral. Once again, please join me in thanking Admiral Sarvis for his excellent keynote speech.